And so I think now is actually a really important time for learning how to communicate, because unless you learn how to communicate, your relationships are going to be strained, right? So let's start by sort of asking, why does like extended periods of time with certain people lead to like a straining of your relationship, whether they be parents or loved ones, spouses? We quote unquote need space. So if we think about it, like, why do we need space? It's because there's some kind of buildup that is happening in the relationship where we use coping mechanisms like getting space from someone that causes that buildup to kind of decompress, right? So over time, something builds up between people. So the question is like, what is that? And chances are usually it's like some degree of emotion. So our goal in the communication topic today is, first of all, to learn how to effectively listen. And second, learn how to effectively speak. And what I mean by this is, let other people know what's inside, right? And if we think about this, this has two parts. One is for you to know what's inside, because unless you understand what's going on in you, how are you going to effectively communicate that to someone else? And second is for you to convey it. How do I say this? Convey it being what's inside, in a non-judgmental way. So like if someone is bothering you, one of the most effective like communication skills is to let them know how they're bothering you without you causing defensiveness, right? Like instead of saying, hey, you're really annoying, you want to be specific about in what way they're annoying. And this is why like emotion sort of has to come before communication, because a lot of like effective listening and effective speaking is knowing you yourself what you're feeling. So let's start as we usually do by understanding, how does communication normally work? Okay. So what I mean by this is, generally speaking, the way that communication works is some person A speaks, and then person B speaks, and then person A speaks again, and person B speaks again, and person A speaks, and person B speaks. And so like a lot of times what's happening is like communication is actually waiting for the other person to shut up so you can say what's on your mind. This is how communication usually works. And if we think about like so let's just use an example of like people with differing political opinions, okay? So let's say that this is their sort of internal emotional state, for lack of a better term. So person A says, some kind of political statement, right? And person B doesn't like really listen to that statement. Like as soon as person A is here, person B starts to formulate their response, right? And what they respond to is this. And then when person B is here, person A stops listening and doesn't really try to understand, but then like goes over here. And there's all kinds of stuff like straw manning and different kinds of like political tactics that are used. But generally speaking, these people aren't really communicating. They're sort of monologuing at each other. And if we look at what happens emotionally with this, so like with the first statement, this person gets a little bit pissed, right? And then this person, when they hear that, gets a little bit pissed. and then they get a little bit more incensed. And then over here, we get even more incensed. And then this over here becomes more incensed. And then over time, like the amount of listening that's happening becomes less and less and less. And that's as the emotions build up here, right? Like this is just worthless. This is not actually communication. It's just like yelling at each other. And then you get into like Twitter wars where, everyone thinks that they're right and everyone thinks that everyone else is wrong, and no one's really communicating with each other. And this is part of the reason that political communication is like so difficult to like, it's so hard to convince people politically, because this is kind of the dynamic, because you're not actually communicating with anyone. You're just talking at them and they're talking at you. So how do we change this? So the way that we change this is by trying to create this situation. Someone else says something. So we're like, how do we change this? Improve communication. So person A says this, and what person B needs to do is actually say the same thing. And then person A will say something else, and person B needs to actually say the same thing. And person A says something else, and then person B says the same thing. And so then you may ask a question, when do I get to share my opinion? And the short answer is, you don't. Right? You don't get to share your opinion. But you're saying, but what about my opinion? Don't I get to speak too? The short answer is no, because what we're going to teach you first is how to effectively listen. And when you're trying to effectively listen, you're not going to try to convey your opinion. So that's the first thing that I want you guys to abandon. If you learn this one simple principle, then your communication is going to be doubly improved. Don't worry, you'll get your chance later, but listening does not involve sharing your opinion. Like, sort of duh, but that's not the way that we think. We're like, a conversation is between two people, right? It's like me talking and then them talking and then like us talking together. Actually, if you want to effectively communicate, you don't want to have a conversation. Effective communication involves one person speaking and then the other person reflecting. Okay, so how does this practically happen? So there are two techniques we're going to talk about today. One is reflective listening. Okay, and the second is validation. And what we want to avoid is our opinion. We want to, and then we avoid our opinion and problem solving. Okay, this is what we want to avoid, and this is what we want to do. So what is an example of reflective listening? Let's say someone comes to you and says, hey, I feel super lonely. Now, your response may be like, I feel super lonely too. Actually, we don't want to sympathize either. I know it sounds bizarre. So let's think about how we respond. So person number one says, I'm feeling lonely. And person number two's response is, first of all, like if we want to be good listeners, we're going to sympathize. So we're saying, I'm feeling lonely too, or not even too. I'm feeling so much more. Loneliness, or yeah, sure, let's stick with two. Okay. So sometimes this leads to one-upmanship. Okay. The second thing that they can say is, why don't you ... They problem solve, right? This is problem solving. And then the third thing is, I think you should, ... This is sharing your opinion. All of these are bad. So instead, what you want to do is say this. Wow, that sucks. And then what we're going to do is followed by, so these two things are followed by an inquiry. Okay? Can you tell me more? And then this person, what does this person say? So this person is here, and then that's your statement to be here. Okay? Then they say, I have nothing to do. Okay? So then instead of saying, okay, so we can go this way. Oh, why don't you download this game? I think you should do this. Oh, you've got nothing to do. Wait till you hear how little I have to do. That's bad. Instead, what you say is, it sounds hard to have nothing to do. Let's do this. Do you feel that way? Right? And yeah, absolutely. Talking like an NPC is absolutely right. And so if you think about this, this sounds like super, super bizarre. But if you guys actually listen to like my Twitch streams, this is basically what I do for an hour and a half. Right? And people like, oh, Dr. K is like such a good communicator. Yeah, it's because like I don't share my opinion. I just kind of reflect back what they say. So they're saying this and you say this. So validation, so reflective listening is actually just repeating back their words, because sometimes what will happen is you'll reflect something back and they'll actually disagree with you. And so what generally happens over the course of conversation is you start here, or they start here and you start here. And then as you guys talk past each other, they start going this way and you start going this way. And then you guys are like really far apart. So with reflective listening is they say this and then you reflect back and then you start to veer this way, but they're saying, no, actually like that's not true. I don't feel so lonely. And then you follow them. And then they go this way. And then you're like, oh, I thought you were there, but no, let's go back over here. And then eventually, sometimes what you can do is you can say, hey, by the way, I think you should consider this. And then if this is the dynamic of communication that you've been doing, they sort of naturally will start to follow you. You see that? Like if you guys have kind of like tied yourselves together at all of these points, then when you suggest something, they're more likely to follow you because you've been following them. Because human beings have this very simple idea of like mirroring what they do to you. If I walk up to someone and I tell them, hey man, you suck, the other person is going to be like, yeah, man, you suck too. But if I say, hey man, you're awesome, what are they going to do? Are they going to say, hey man, you suck? No. If you tell them they're awesome, they're going to tell you you're awesome. And so if you listen to them and reflect to them and you make them feel heard, they're more likely to listen to you. And this is where like I don't know if you guys, I remember reading about, this guy who was African American who like convinced KKK people that like the KKK was dumb. And the way that he did it was not by like yelling at them and being like, hey, KKK people, you guys are idiots. What he did is he like went and befriended them. And then like when you take a racist person and like they befriend someone of like, the race that they're discriminatory against, they're like, well, actually, like, this is kind of silly. Like, why? I mean, this dude's pretty cool. Like, maybe all black people aren't bad. And that's because they use this technique, this is the technique of political argument. And all that happens at the end of this is everyone thinks that everyone else is an idiot. And no one changes minds. When you use this technique, it actually changes profoundly like how people kind of see you and how they see themselves, and that you guys can actually communicate. Okay. So This is how we essentially learn to listen better, right? And like you can say, but I'm not saying anything. And like, yeah, you're not saying anything because you're listening. Like the goal of phase one is not to say anything. It's just to listen and make them feel heard and make them feel like you guys are on the same page, because you are. This will also increase your understanding of their viewpoint, because you're not trying to convince them of everything. So you actually like spend the time to like learn what they say, right? You kind of follow along, and then you're going to deepen your understanding of them. And here's the thing. If someone is trying to convince you of something, are you more likely to listen to what they say if you feel like they understand you? Or are you more likely to listen if you feel like they don't understand you? And that's kind of like, it's kind of silly, because like, obviously if someone understands you, you're more likely to listen to them. So then the question becomes, if you want to be an effective communicator, how do you convince someone that you understand them? Right? So now we're sort of transitioning to phase two, which is sharing your opinion and sharing your feelings. And if you want to convince them, if you want them to listen, they need to believe you understand them and their viewpoint, not to attack their viewpoint, right? So like when you attack their viewpoint, they're like, oh, this guy's attacking me. I don't want to listen to him. Let's put the walls up. And there's numerous studies that show that when you attack someone's viewpoint, like it doesn't matter how dumb it is or how incorrect it is, they are going to double down and will ignore the more data you present, the more convinced they become that they are right. So presenting data in an argument with someone that you disagree with has the opposite effect as what people think. And then like, this is where is people get politically divided. Everyone thinks the other side is stupid, right? The conclusion is like, people who support XYZ are dumb. And it doesn't matter. You can present as much data as you want to. It's going to be irrelevant. It's not going to change anyone's mind. The first thing that you've got to do, and like if you guys, I mean, I like politics because I think it's a good example of how like people don't effectively communicate and you don't get anywhere. So how do you convince someone that you understand them? Because if you understand them, they're more likely to listen to you. So even when I talk to like gamers who have went and seen mental health professionals, sometimes what I hear is that like, you know, the psychiatrist didn't understand gaming. And so what they say is, I never went back. I hear this story a lot, right? So do you guys see how like, I never went back is because of this. One leads to the other. So they shut off from anything that the psychiatrist had to say. So what we need to do is we need to start by convincing someone that you understand them, because if you understand them, they're likely to listen. And the way that you do that is by following this path, right? Where you just stay with them. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you guys a question. What is the right answer? How do you reflectively listen to this statement? I'm a complete piece of crap and I have no value in life. Okay, option one is, no, you're amazing. You are awesome. I love you. Or two, sounds like you feel like you're worthless. Or three, I feel really worthless too. What's the right response if we're reflectively listening? Right? So you guys got it right. It sounds like you feel like you're worthless. So this is really bizarre, because our instinct is that when someone says, oh, I'm a worthless piece of crap, our instinct is to try to support them and boost them up. But that's actually, so I want you guys to think about this for a second, right? When I say I'm worthless, that's me going this way. And when you say you're awesome, which way are you going? You're going this way. Completely opposite directions. Right? So then they're going to think like if, and think about this, like when you feel like a piece of crap and someone tries to reassure you at the beginning, so eventually you can kind of get there. So we're going to kind of table that for a second. But when someone says like, yeah, man, I'm really ugly. And then someone says like, when your parents tell you, no, you're beautiful. Like, how seriously do you take them? You're like, screw you. Like, you don't understand me at all. And then like, what do you do afterward? Even though they're trying to be supportive, what do you do afterward? You ignore everything else they have to say because you're like, this person doesn't get it. Like, they don't get it. So you start by staying with them, right? You start by doing this. And it feels kind of weird. So then let's get to phase 2. Okay, so after you do this for a while, so let's say like you give this like 10 or 15 minutes. Someone's asking you how long do you do that? I mean, I'd say somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes. Then we get to phase 2, which is learn how to effectively speak. Okay, so how to effectively speak. So there are 2 components here. One is understanding yourself. And what do I mean by this? Like if someone at home is irritating you or your friends are irritating you, you have to understand like why they're irritating you. Like you have to understand like what's irritating. So we had a couple of days ago, I think we had someone on stream who was talking about, I think it was the dude who had the major setback, the PhD student. And he was kind of saying that like when he was unemployed, his parents once every 2 weeks would call him and ask him, how's the job search going? And that would piss him off, right? I know I certainly felt the same way because when I was unemployed and looking for a job, like the worst thing to do was when your parents ask you for an update and you had no update to give. And like, I remember just thinking like, I'll give you an update when I have something decent to say. But every time they asked that question, I felt like all of this avoidance that I was playing so many video games to ignore the fact that I don't have a job. And here they come along and they ask me if I have a job and then I can't ignore it then. I can't ignore it anymore. Stop making me look at it. I don't want to look at it. Right? Like I'm trying to ignore it and here you come trying to be a concerned parent. Screw you. So the first thing is you have to understand yourself. So you can't, if you go to your parents and you say, I want you to stop asking me if I found a job yet. And then like they're not going to understand, right? So you have to understand yourself. So this is where like you have to figure out, okay, if you find something frustrating, and this is going to happen when you guys are stuck with other people at home, frustration, you start with frustration, right? That's the first thing you're going to feel. And then you have to ask yourself, where does that come from? And then you're going to come up with an answer, right? Like, because I haven't found a job yet. And then you ask yourself, why does that bother you? And then you kind of like play some of this game where you try to track back, like what's the actual emotion that you feel? And then you come back to your parents and you say, you start by holding their viewpoint. So when you speak, this is the first thing, start with their viewpoint. Okay. The other way that you can do this, if you guys are having this kind of conversation here, the other way to do this is to summarize what they said. So you stop right here and then you summarize. This is also holding their viewpoint. Okay. Or summarize what they've said. So you can say something like, with your parents, like let's say that, so let's use this job example, right? So your parents tell you, I think they ask you, have you found a job yet? Or how's the job search going? And then you say, can you please stop asking me that question? It's frustrating. And then they say, but we're just concerned about you. Like, we just want to make sure you're doing okay and we want to try to help you. And that's them going this way. And you're like, yeah, I don't want your help. I don't need your help. I'm fine. And they're like, yeah, but we love you. And like, we're just a little bit worried. And then you're like, no, I'm fine. Everything's okay. So you guys are getting further along. So the way that you start is by actually looping back around and going here, right? And then what you do is you say, I know y'all are concerned, and that you love me, period. I feel like, so then would you say something like this? I feel ashamed every time you ask that question because I haven't made any progress. Then you can kind of go on to say, you know, you guys asking, I'm not saying, I know that you guys want to ask and that you guys are concerned and you have every right to ask. Okay. Come on. Can you go to mama? Thank you, Lovey. So like when you say like, hey, every time you ask me about my job, I know you guys are concerned that I'm doing okay. And I know that y'all want to help, but I know it's bizarre, but it actually has the opposite effect of helping. What it does is it actually makes me feel more ashamed, and it highlights in my mind that like I haven't made any progress, and it makes me feel incapable. So I was hoping that instead of asking me like every couple of weeks, like maybe I could let you guys know when I have an update for you. Does that kind of make sense? Like, does that sound, and then like when you do that, and then when you kind of tell them every time you ask, it doesn't actually help. It actually kind of bizarrely has the opposite effect. And I'm trying to figure out, and so you kind of say your piece, and then the third thing. So remember, step 1 is summarizing. Okay. Then step 2 is say your piece. And step 3 is ask them what they think. Now, this is the crucial part, because they've said this, you've said this, they've said this, you've said this, they've said this, and then you switch things up. You go over here. And now this is really, really critical, because this is their opportunity to do one of two things, right? Either they go here or they go here. And now the tricky thing is that if they go here, then what you need to do is actually go back here. And then they're going to go here, and then you're going to go here, and then they're going to go here, and then you're going to go here. So you're kind of back to square one. And then you try it again, right? So then they're over here, and then you go here, and then you check in with them. You listen again, and then they're going to go here. And you're like, okay, so then you're going to listen to them for a little while, right? They go here, you go here. And then you're like, all right, third time's a charm. So you go here. And then what happens is something magical is going to happen. They're going to go here. And then once they do that, then you move here. And then they go here. And then you go here. And then they go here. Sorry. That's a mistake. Right? So then you can move them further along. It's getting confusing. Okay, sorry. Okay. So what I mean by that is like, so you listen to what they say and you summarize what they say. And then you share your opinion, and then you got to check in with them and see if they understand what you said. Because if they just continue thinking their way, then you have to stop and you have to like listen to what they say and then like try again. But if they don't understand, if they're not able to reflect back, you can't keep moving forward. Okay? So draw the map. So maybe we'll try that. Okay? So let's say that, you know, they're over here and you're listening to them, and then you try to go over here. And one of two things is going to happen. Either they will go this way or they'll continue going this way. And if they go this way, then you can keep going and you can keep leading them, right? That's scenario number one. But scenario number two is they're talking over here. So then like you can't keep going this way. You have to deviate and go back this way. And then you're like, all right, let's try this again. I don't think you guys get it. When you ask me questions, you think it's helping, but it's actually hurting. And they're like, no, but we love you so much. Like, we just want to help. And then they're like, yeah, I don't think you guys get it. I know that you feel that it's helping, and I know that you're trying to help, but what I'm telling you is that it's having the opposite effect. And then eventually they're going to be like, oh, you're saying it's having the opposite effect. And then you're like, yes. Yes, that is exactly correct. And they're like, oh, no, but like, we love you. And then you're like, no, fuck. Come back this way. And they're like, okay, this is what effective communication actually looks like. Okay? It's a laborious process at first. But this is just because this is not how we're trained to speak. Like, once you get good at this, you can do it all the time. It becomes easy. Okay? So, let me just think about this. Okay. So let's go back to this. Okay? So, first thing that we've talked about is learn how to effectively listen. So what that means is reflective listening and validation, and then learn how to effectively speak. So the first thing is you've got to understand what is frustrating for you. Like, I'll give you guys another example. Like, so let's say that someone says a joke that's offensive to you, and then you say like, hey man, I don't think that's very funny. And then what's their response? Their response is, oh, what's the matter? Can't you take a joke? And they're going to keep saying that, and they're going to think that you're an idiot who can't take a joke until you appropriately vocalize what is offensive about that joke to you. And that starts with a summary, right? So that starts with I understand that you think this is just funny because dead babies are like a funny thing to you. And I sort of get how, like, if you actually haven't dealt with a dead baby, like, you would think that that's funny because it's sort of crass and it sort of like triggers something. But I actually work in a neonatal ICU where I try to save babies' lives, and sometimes they die. And every time they die, it kind of like, it's hard on me because then I have to go and tell their parents that the baby is dead. And that's certainly not funny. And so when you talk about dead babies, like, my experience is just so different from yours that, like, that's something that I struggle with every day. Right? And like, when you explain something like that, and like, let's say you're in a break room, right? Because this is where a lot of these like offensive jokes kind of happen, and people are like, oh, that's just so funny. Like, you just don't get it. Right? Like, oh, like, you can't take a joke. And it's like, no, man, like, I want you to understand where I'm coming from. And then you can ask them, does that make sense to you? So this is where, even with the dead baby joke, right? So they're starting here. Okay, so this is dead babies, her, right? And then you're like, oh, I kind of get you. So this is the first thing. So your instinct is to go this way, but you can't go that way. What you want to do is you want to go like this. And you're like, yeah, I sort of get that, like, you know, it's sort of crass and it's kind of like emotionally alarming. But here is what my experience is. And then you have to ask them right here. Sorry. You have to ask them right here. Do you get me? So this is the big problem, is we usually don't say that. We just assume we're right? Does that make sense to you? So anytime you share your opinion, you have to ask people, to you. So like, can you actually get here, or do you end up over here? And if they say, yeah, it makes sense to me, or if they say like, no, I don't quite understand, then at least you're evoking that sentiment from them. Like you're evoking that there's a difference. And if you think about it, like if someone says, yes, that makes sense to me, then either they're going to shut the hell up, because then it doesn't make sense for them to say, yeah, that makes sense to me, and then for them to continue making jokes. Or they're going to say like, no, it doesn't make sense to me. And then you guys can at least agree that you're not on the same place. And then you can say, can I try to explain it again? That's your next question, right? So then you're like, okay, I'm with you. Is it okay if we go this way? Is that okay? And then they're going to either say like something like, oh, it's really not that big of a deal. And they may make some kind of like other sort of like whiffly statement where they try to change the subject. And then you can kind of point that out to them. So you can say, I hear you saying that it's not a big deal. So once again, we're going to reflect, okay? I hear you saying that it's not a big deal, but I don't think you're hearing me, because my whole point that I'm trying to explain to you is that it actually is a big deal to me. Are you understanding that this is actually important to me? And then usually at that point, they just tuck their tails between their leg and they run away because you've dominated them. And so someone is asking, what if they're right? So this is not, so I want you guys to understand this for a second. Which of these sides is right? Right? Like, is this right or is this right? There's no rightness or wrongness. There's no rightness or wrongness here. Like this is where there's no sense of right or wrong. This is about being on the same page or not being on the same page. Okay? It's about like communication is not about right or wrong. You got like girl got to understand this, very important, okay? This has nothing to do with right and wrong. And if you think that this has to do with right and wrong, you're missing the entire point. The whole point of the communication exercise is to go from here to here. The point of the communication exercise and learning how to communicate is so that this doesn't happen. We're not presuming any kind of rightness or wrongness. So someone's asking, how would you respond if they say they don't care? So then you can say like, I mean, I would reflect that back to them. Right? So like that's going to make them sound like an asshole. So you can say, so it sounds like you basically don't have any sense of caring about what I think or feel. And that like, generally speaking, the opinions of some people or their experience of life is completely irrelevant to you. Right? You just reflect back. If they say, I don't care, man. If you want to get bent out of shape, you can get bent out of shape. And then you can say, yeah, so it sounds like you really don't care if you go around like upsetting other people or like impacting their lives in a negative way. And then they say, yeah, man, I don't care. And then like, who's the asshole at the end of that? Right? So like, I think once again, it's reflection, summary, inquiry. So this is our summary, okay? We'll go to questions. So I'm going to queue people up for questions while we're summarizing. So we're going to do Luca, Milope, Shawl, and Tadias. And here's our summary. So step 1 is reflection. Step 2 is inquiry. Actually, let's say summary. So you guys get that. You have to reflect a lot, okay? So maybe actually step 2 is reflection. Step 3 is reflection. Right? And at this point, they feel you understand them. Then what happens is summary. So you summarize their point. You don't try to pick it apart. You don't disagree with them. Remember, like if you're trying to convince them from the get-go, this is going to fall apart. The goal here is not to dominate them or convince them or poke holes in their argument. Their goal is genuinely to understand. Because if you're actually going over here, but you're pretending to go over here, that's not going to work. You actually need to be with them and try to put yourself in their shoes. And if you do this well, then they are really confident you understand them. And now they're primed. They're ready. Then what you do is inquire. Are you willing to go this way with me? And then if they say yes, then you make your point or share your perspective is maybe a better way to put it. And then either they're going to go this way or they're going to go this way. And then you have to either things are check, you're done. And then you can even ask them a question like ask them to summarize. Right? Because then if they summarize well, then you are really confident that they understand you. And then you guys are on the same page. And the way you ask them to summarize is, can you tell me what you heard? Like, can you tell me what you understood from what I said? Like, what did you understand? Like, what did you catch about what I said? And so then when you ask them to summarize, let's say you're going like, so they're going this way. And so you're like, okay, and then let's go this way. And they're like, sure, let's go that way. So they go this way. And then they like get halfway there and they start going over here. And then you're like, no, but hold on. This is what I was kind of saying. Can you follow me? And then you ask them to summarize again. And they're like, oh yeah, so you said this, this, and this. But then I thought you were saying this. And then you're like, no, man. This is what you heard. This is what you heard me say. But what I'm really saying is this. And they're like, oh, okay, now I get it. Right? So each of these points is kind of like the summary happens kind of over here. And then if you guys deviate at some point, you got to come back to this. And is it a laborious process? Absolutely. But I want you guys to think about this for a second. How laborious, like a political conversation where you disagree with someone is just as laborious. It just feels better and you feel more righteous and it accomplishes less. But you can spend just as much effort communicating the other way and you're just not going to get anywhere. Like it doesn't really matter. So I think this is way better. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay. Let's do questions. I tried to, are people not, Luca? I've got time for maybe 2 questions, okay? Judith, Dennis, and Salvatore.